watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael, on a Thursday, doing our second show for the day here, joined by Philip Campbell, who is the author of this book right here, which I have a link to there in the description. This is The Church in the Dark Ages. It's continuing the series of interviews that we've, in fact, done for a series of books reclaiming Catholic history. So this is going to cover the ages roughly from 430 to 1027, what's often called the Dark Ages, which weren't so dark, in my opinion, if you were to ask me, but we'll get Philip's opinion here on that here in a moment. First, welcome to the show, Philip. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, glad to have you on. It just quickly, just for us to know, do you think that that's kind of a misnomer, Dark Ages?
It depends on what you're referring to. If you're talking to the spiritual life of the church, then no. If you're talking about dentistry, then yes.
That's one way to put it. Yeah, you know what? I agree. It seems like there were some pretty amazing writers and mystics in that age, in
Yes.
that time period, I should say. So I don't find the Dark Ages to be very dark. Seems like that title came much later by those who didn't really like the Catholic Church, from what I could tell.
Yep.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let's talk about it. I mean, first of all, just kind of explain again the time period of the Dark Ages. I mentioned that it's 430 to 1027, but what are just some general broad things we need to know about this time period before we dive into the specifics?
Yeah, well, from the very outset, when I wrote this book, it was, I mean, at the very beginning, it was difficult to even narrow down what time period I was talking about because people have different concepts of what they mean by the Dark Ages. I mean, as you kind of alluded to, this isn't a phrase that Catholics really should use. In fact, it's not even a phrase that secular historians prefer anymore, just because it's such a biased term. And as you know, the angle of the book is really trying to talk about what this period was really like, why it wasn't actually a dark period. But some people mean by the Dark Ages, this mean the whole period before like 1789, you know, like before modernity. I really had to kind of narrow down like what period we're really talking about here. So it's really the era after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in Western Europe, but before before the Crusades, before the emergence of the High Middle Ages. We're still in like the formative phase of Europe, kind of climaxing with the Carolingian Empire. So 430 to 1027, the dates seem kind of arbitrary. 430 is the death of St. Augustine of Hippo, who I kind of took in this book to be like the last patristic representative in the West of the high classical Greco-Roman tradition. And then 1027 was the Peace of God Accords, which was where the church got knights to agree not to fight on certain days of the week.
Right.
And I took that as kind of symbolic of the transformation of like the old barbarian warrior ethos into something like chivalry. So
Right.
I mean, I had to end it somewhere.
Sure, of course. Now, talking about the first part there with, the Roman Empire in the West and the fall of the empire in the time of St. Augustine. Of course, you talk a little bit there in the beginning about St. Augustine and his response to those who say that the reason why the empire fell in the West is because of Christians. And, of course, Christians forsaking or not agreeing with the veneration of the Roman gods. And of course, right, Augustine responds to that in the City of God and refutes that. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that and the importance of that work?
Yeah. So Augustine began City of God around the year 410 when Rome was sacked by Alaric. And at the time that Rome was sacked, there was this widespread panic throughout the Roman world and among the pagan population, which was still substantial at the time. This slander that the reason Rome was falling was because of the empire's adoption of Christianity, specifically that the abandonment of the old gods had it had made the gods angry, and so they were punishing punishing the empire. So Augustine began the City of God as a refutation of this idea, and then of course it spiraled into this huge multi-book tome on all aspects of Christian faith. But it's a very pivotal work. I think it's the supreme patristic apologetic for Christianity. And I like it because he starts with a historical argument. He starts with, they're saying that the abandonment of pagan worship is what brought this disaster about, and he starts with, here's all the 700 or 800 years, like the pagan gods didn't save Rome from the Gauls. They didn't save all these other disasters that happen. And so he's always trying to ground his argument in reason, and kind of get away from the superstition of the pagan age, which I think is very important. So as a work that kind of segues from one period to the next, his work is really influenced. Future generations of Catholic scholars in the Middle Ages are going to look to Augustine as like the definitive exposition of the Christian view of history, of how history unfolds, and how we are to understand the church in history, now that it's not a little persecuted minority in the empire, but now that it is Christendom, that it is civil society. How are we to understand the movement of history? And the City of God is really helpful because Augustine, right at the beginning of the Middle Ages, he warns us not to identify any political or social reality with the City of God. Absolutely. You might have a Christian empire, you might have, a Christian country, you might have something like the early United States where there was a broad acceptance of Christian values. But you can't equate those things directly with the City of God. You have to remember that the City of God is the church that transcends all these different kingdoms and polities, and that it's moving on towards its own destiny, and that these temporal empires will rise and fall. And that's such I don't know, I just think that's such an appropriate way to kick off the Middle Ages, because, as you know, debates between church and state are going to pretty much dominate medieval life.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, a little bit later in the book, you talk about the missionary activity of Christians in the territory of Gaul. Can you speak a little bit about that and its significance, especially for this time period?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, the missionary activity of Christians in the territory of Gaul. You go over this in the book. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that and the importance for this time period?
Yeah, so it's really mysterious when Christian activity started in Gaul. It I think that most historians believe it came through Marseille and Lyon in the south, with missionaries that came from the Greek-speaking world, like Saint Irenaeus was a Greek, but he was the bishop of Lyon, and then it kind of spread out northward from there. One of the early centers of Christianity in Gaul was Poitiers. I don't know how they said it in the Roman times. I think that's the later French
It's a
pronunciation.
challenge to say it now. Yeah,
Yeah,
Poitiers.
Hillary of Poitiers.
Pointers. I like that one. I'm gonna have to start saying that now.
Yeah. No, but so in the the early patristic times, like before the Council of Nicaea, Lyon was really the center of Christianity there, and then it just kind of spread. When we get to in Christian times after the Council of Nicaea, it is in Poitiers where you get these great figures like Saint Hilary, and then other centers like Arles, and I don't even know if I'm saying that. French is not my language, but it's in Gaul, I think, where you get this real magnificent blending of like this educated, erudite, kind of Christian scholarly tradition that mixes with the Gallo-Roman kind of civic tradition. And I think after the death of Augustine, for the next century, some of the brightest luminaries of the church are the ones that come out of Gaul, especially Saint Hilary, Prosper of Aquitaine, even Saint Martin of Tours, although we don't think of him as a scholar. But just Gaul is really the powerhouse of the church for the 400s, and that's going to be the branching off point for the missionary work into Ireland later under the Merovingians. That's going to be the like leaping off point for the missionaries that will go into Germania. So it's really like the springboard, and this is not even after that Gaul itself. Once the Franks take over, of course, it will become Christian in the time of Clovis. But even before the Franks become Christian, Roman Gaul is a powerful center of Christianity. So I'd always known that France was called the Church's eldest daughter, and I thought that was just because King Clovis was the first king in the old Roman Empire to convert to Christianity. But really, Gaul has a long tradition that even predates Clovis of being like a kind of the first great center of Christianity in the West outside of Italy. I mean, in my opinion. So I think it's very important in the development of Latin Christianity in the West for sure. I'm not sure if that was what you're looking to
Yeah,
go
that
into,
was
but
actually very,
yeah.
very helpful. Now, around this part, this section of the book, you have I think the section is called "You Be the Judge." I think where you have these parts interspersed throughout the book, and you ask the question: did Augustine invent the doctrine of original sin? What say ye?
No, he did not invent the doctrine of original sin. He was the authoritative expositor of the doctrine,
Hmm.
right? I mean, you can find original sin referenced in the New Testament. Um, Saint Augustine was the authoritative expositor of the doctrine, and I think his arguments for it became standard.
Mm.
But it's really ridiculous to say he invented it. And when Augustine is making these arguments, he's appealing. He's not coming up with something novel. He's appealing to a widely accepted tradition that that had not been denied until the emergence of Pelagianism.
Yeah, and I appreciate you tackling that. There's a lot of a lot of people, especially coming from a more Eastern Christian tradition, who question original sin, at least as it's understood in the West, and kind of take up that position that Saint Augustine invented this doctrine. So yeah, I definitely appreciate that. Now, after this, you talk about the Age of Saint Benedict. Tell us a little bit about him and why is he important to the Dark Ages?
Well, gosh, that's a big question.
It really
um,
is because he did so much and he's so influential. So yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
I've studied Benedict many times. I've come back to the rule of Benedict many times in my own personal life
Yeah.
over the years, reading it from a young man up till now, being not a young man anymore. But um, it, well, I would frame it this way: um, the social life of the West that had been inherited from the Greco-Roman tradition really broke down at the time of the fall of the Roman Empire. And in Italy, it was especially profound because of the disastrous wars that ravaged Italy for a long time in the late 400s, throughout the 500s, with the wars of the Ostrogoths and the Byzantines, the Lombards. So Italy was in a particularly bad state. And I think what Benedict did by renouncing the world, going into the wilderness, spending time in solitude, and then formulating his rule, I think what he did was he kind of reformulated, reconstituted a new set of spiritual values
Mm,
for the West to be centered around.
mm.
It was it was profound, and I'm sure he didn't. It's such an irony in the history of Christianity how God works, how you get these people that are like, I'm going to go be alone on a mountain, and then they end up like being profoundly influential in the development of civilization. We're still talking about him 1600 years later.
Like
It-
Saint
it-
Anthony of the Desert. Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
he went out in the desert and he thought, this is the last anyone's going to hear of me.
Right.
And God had other plans.
Sure.
But um, it was clear that the Benedictine movement was not just what Europe needed, spiritually. Obviously, it's a way for Christians to live out the evangelical counsels, but I think socially they needed that too. The monasteries became the centers of education, the centers of community, the centers of in many cases of civic life, because they'd have a monastery that'd be founded, and then people would want to be near that monastery for various reasons. Then towns would grow up around it, like Kildare in Ireland, which wasn't Benedictine, but um,
Mm,
so they just became profoundly important centers that kind of like the little nuclei that medieval civilization grew up around. And this was all because of Saint Benedict. For a long, long time, the Benedictine rule was the only rule
mhm.
in the West that had major traction. It was the only very broadly practiced. Well, people in the comments are going to say, what about the Irish monastic? Well, yes, that was a totally different tradition that predated the Benedictine tradition, and very, very widespread as well. So I shouldn't say the Benedictine was the only one, but it ended up being the most influential one. And in fact, for the first several centuries, whenever you get reform movements, like the second Saint Ben, many people don't know there's a Benedict sequel. There's a second Benedict, Saint Benedict of Anian, who reformed the Benedictine rule in the time of Louis the Pious. But a lot of these early reform movements, they weren't even separate orders. They were just attempts to get back to the heart of what Benedict wanted. They were going back to the font of Benedict's original vision. So it was such a profoundly stirring spiritual vision that moved Christians in that time, and it still continues to move them today, even though now we have many more religious orders. But it's hard to overestimate the importance of this rule and this person in the spiritual heritage of the West, and in its even in the political and social development of the West.
Do you think that Benedict's vision and his rule has any applications to our situation today in the West?
Yeah, and there's various ways we could take that question.
Yeah, right.
But if you get back to the heart of the rule, so the heart of Benedict's rule is that, at the beginning of his rule, he talks about how there's all these different kinds of monks, and they do all these different things, and he thinks they're all inferior monks for various reasons, and he thinks that his form of monasticism is more palatable, because the great thing about Benedict's monasticism is it's accessible to normal people, or that's what Benedict believes. He believes that his rule takes monasticism and it puts it within the range of the average Christian to accomplish. You no longer have to say, I'm going to go live in a harsh desert cave and put my head on a rock and only eat once every 6 days or something. The Eastern Fathers are wonderful. They're wonderful mystics. They're wonderful ascetics. But I think Benedict recognized that the ascetical practices of many of the famous Eastern Fathers were bound, just by virtue of their rigor, to be out of the reach of ordinary Christians who wanted to pursue holiness. And so what he gives us is a rule that he feels the average person can keep. It's very balanced. It's very methodical. It's very rational. He simply divides up the day and says, you're going to come together and pray this many times, then you're going to eat, then you're going to work, then you're going to study, and we're just going to do that. And the good thing is about that is it takes the rule becomes like a hammer and anvil, right? It doesn't depend on the individual heroic ascetics of like an extremely extremely ascetical monk or sister. Basically, you just do the rule, you do it faithfully, and over time that rule hammers you. It's like a hammer and forge that turns you into the image of Christ, and it's something that anybody can do. And I think Benedict's intuition was right because of how popular it became. I mean, you certainly had hermits in the West, but there was nothing in the West comparable to the proliferation of the Benedictine rule. It was just extremely popular because of its great balance. I think that's what Benedict valued more than anything.
That's true.
That's my opinion, at least.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. Now, you have another one of those "you be the judge" where you ask the question, were Christians responsible for the decline of literacy in the West during the Dark Ages? First of all, was there really a decline, and if so, who was responsible for it?
Let me look that back up in my book, because
Yeah.
I want to review. That was one of the first that section when I was first writing like the sample chapters for this book.
Yeah.
That was like the first one I wrote.
Okay.
And I wrote it like 2.5 years ago. So
We often have the impression that, the people in the Dark Ages were illiterate. So,
yeah.
yeah, I'm kind of curious, how you would approach that one.
Well, it's true. Oh, okay. I remember this. Sorry, sometimes people ask me questions about the book, and I'm like, "Oh, I wrote that 2.5 years ago. I don't remember what it was."
I know how that goes. Some of the things I've written, I look back on it and I
Uh,
think, oh wow, I forgot about this entirely. I didn't even know I wrote that.
yeah, so it is true. It is true that literacy declined in the Dark Ages, in the early Middle Ages, simply because the amount of people who were literate went down. But the people who were literate weren't any less literate, if that makes
Right.
any sense. See, the thing is, in the Greco-Roman period, literacy was a prerequisite for meaningful participation in civic life. If you wanted to serve as a magistrate, you wanted to stand for office, you wanted to work in the imperial bureaucracy, you want to do any of these things, you needed to be literate. But with the decline of the Roman Empire, and not just the decline of the empire, but the decline of urban life in the West, which is a big consequence of the fall of the empire, the decline of city life, transition into rural life. That means that there's no vast imperial civil service as an outlet for educated people to work in or serve in. And so if there are people who are skilled or talented or literate, they're going to go into the church, because the church is the only large institution that requires literacy still at that point, right?
Mhm.
But second, we have to remember that the very rulers of these kingdoms weren't literate. You go from a very literate government under Rome, and then you get to like the Ostrogoths and the Vandals and the Franks and kingdoms like this, and even very late into the early medieval period, it was still common for the rulers of these kingdoms to not be literate. If you read the life of Charlemagne, who's very late, 4 centuries into this period, it says that he could not write. And Charlemagne makes up an excuse for why he can't write. He says, I've had so many battles, my hand is permanently stuck like this from holding my sword, so I can't, regrettably, I can't hold a quill. I would be literate, but my hand, I think that's a kind of like a pious little joke on the monastic chronicler's part. But the fact is, even someone as important as Charlemagne, probably was still, unable to write, at least. It's not until you get further in the Middle Ages that it becomes common for these lords to be literate. So simply, if the guy who's governing your whole empire and kingdom, if he himself is not literate, the government machinery doesn't need a huge literate caste, and to the degree they do, it's served by monks, by men like Alcuin in the court of Charlemagne, or just these various monastic figures who show up in the courts of early European monarchs. So, literacy declined. It's more because of the social and political circumstance. But the people who were literate, the people who could still read, the clerics, they were very literate. I mean, they not only were producing their own corpus of work and writings, B, they were passing on all the stuff from antiquity that they inherited, also all the ancient and not just Christian writings. It's kind of this weird myth that Christians destroyed all the pagan writings. Is absolutely not true. If they did, they did a horrible job at it, because a lot of ancient stuff survived. So much of the ancient world. When you read the Iliad and the Odyssey and the ancient Greek works, we didn't find a 8th century BC Greek manuscript of that. Those were copied from, I can't, this is off the top of my head. I want to say the earliest copy of the Iliad is from the 9th century or something, copied.
Yeah, it's pretty late.
Yeah, something copied by medieval monks. So these guys were amazing in their literary output. So, literacy declined, but it's relative to what was going on in the world at the time.
So let's talk a little bit about the missionary activity by some of these monks in the Dark Ages. You talk a little bit about Cyril and Methodius. They're incredibly important. In fact, I think they're co-patrons of Europe. They're so significant. Yeah, talk to me a little bit about them and their activity.
So Cyril and Methodius are known as apostles to the Slavs, and there's this. So back in the back in the early church, you had an ecclesiastical arrangement that's known as the Pentarchy, which was like five major sees, right? Rome, Constantinople, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria. And then you had your metropolitan sees, which were like the larger ancient cities like Aquila or Ephesus or place like that. And they would all kind of be under one of the patriarchal sees. And then the other suffragan dioceses would be under those. So everybody knew who was above them in the ecclesiastical pecking order. So obviously, as Islam spread out, the three furthest eastern sees fell under Islamic rule. Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria were gone under Islam, and then you were left with just Constantinople and Rome. So obviously, everything in the west is going to fall under Rome. Everything in the east is going to fall under Constantinople. But then there's this weird spot in Europe that is like kind of like between Rome and Constantinople, right? It's like in the Balkans, in the Slavic lands. One could make a reasonable argument that as you go across the Adriatic into Dalmatia and what is now modern-day Croatia, that, hey, that's just a hop, skip, and a jump from Rome. This should be under the Latin Patriarch. But you could also make an argument, no, this stuff is close to Constantinople. It should be under Constantinople. So the Greeks and the Latins were both trying to evangelize this area in the early Middle Ages. And there was disputes over where the ecclesiastical jurisdiction lie. Now, as I recall, and it's been a while since I've studied this Cyril and Methodius, as I recall, they were originally from the East, but they ended up being sent over by the Pope. And I can't remember the nature of the dispute, but they ended up getting sent by the Pope. They went to the Slavic lands, and they're famous for coming up with the alphabet, which is known as Glagolithic, and putting the liturgy into that form for the people there. But after people in the comments are going to know more than me, which one died first?
Oh boy.
Yeah, I don't want to say the wrong thing. One of the brothers died first, died quite a bit younger, and then the other one ended up staying and fighting for the Slavic liturgies, because after a while Rome decided we don't like the Slavic liturgy, we want it in Latin, and they were fighting to keep it in their language. But anyhow, it was this interesting story where there's a lot of intersection of of liturgy, of culture, of disputes about jurisdiction, of and just the beauty of these brothers creating a language from scratch, like for these people. Like you gotta be impressed with the fortitude of these missionaries. Like, oh, you don't have a written language, no big deal. I'll write one, and then I'll translate all this stuff into it for you. Of course, in North America, we know Saint Jean de Brebeuf did something similar for the Hurons. So I think it was a very important episode in kind of like the dispute between where those lands were going to fall. And even to this day, it's very complicated, because you'll have an overlap with Orthodoxy and Latin Rite throughout that region that still hasn't, totally been resolved.
Yeah, that's true. And speaking of the Orthodox, there's another figure that you cover, and that is Saint Maximus the Confessor, who's highly venerated both among the Orthodox and Catholics. In fact, some kind of see him as a bridge between Catholicism and Orthodoxy on a number of matters. Let's talk a little bit about Saint Maximus, and especially his perspective on the papacy, if you don't mind going into that a little bit.
Yeah, I think I had a quote from him, and I think I had that quote in the book.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to find it here.
Mm-hmm.
Maximus the Confessor, because this is a good quote. I don't want to wing it from memory.
He's really good when it comes to the papacy. Although some Orthodox try to give some pushback on him and try to say that he effectively argued that, well, if Rome falls away from the faith, I won't follow Rome. But long story short, it seems like he held to the papal claims.
Yeah, if I recall, he was the source of his he was part of the monotheletist controversy
Mhm.
in the 7th century,
Mhm.
which is a very complicated. It's like kind of like the last gasp of the early Christological heresies, and he was
Mhm.
not happy with one of the formulas that uh, that was being pushed in the East by the Emperor Constans II. And so
Mhm.
he goes over to Rome because Rome was having a synod. I think this was like in the middle of the 7th century.
Mhm.
And they were going to condemn monothelitism. And Maximus writes, he's trying to explain himself to the bishops of Constantinople. They're like, why have you abandoned our emperor? Why'd you go over to Rome to oppose Emperor Constans? And he wrote this letter back and said, quote, "For the very ends of the earth and those in every part of the world who purely and rightly confess the Lord look directly to the most holy church of the Romans and its confession of faith as though it were a sun of unfailing light,
Mhm.
expecting from it the illuminating splendor of the fathers and the sacred dogmas. For, ever since the incarnate Word of God came down to us, all the churches of Christians everywhere have held that greatest church there, that is in Rome, to be their sole base and foundation, since on the one hand it has no way been overcome by the gates of Hades, according to the promise of the Savior,
Mhm.
but holds the keys of the orthodox confession of faith in Him and opens the only true and real religion to those who approach with godliness. And on the other hand, it shuts up and locks every heretical mouth that speaks unrighteous against the Most High." So that was what he wrote back to the Eastern bishops to explain why he was siding with the Pope. He was essentially saying, we know from antiquity that it's in the Church of Rome where the gates of hell cannot prevail,
Right.
that the keys of orthodoxy are held, and this is where everybody has traditionally looked to. Now, it's interesting that Maximus, if I recall, he later went home, or was sent home or captured or something, and he had his tongue cut out.
Mhm.
And I haven't said anything that I haven't read anything that said his tongue was cut out specifically for that specific statement.
Mhm.
But I think
Mhm.
it's just interesting that that was the punishment he had, was his tongue was pulled out. They must have been angry with something he said,
Right.
presumably. I wonder if
Right.
that was it.
That's usually what they would do is cut off your tongue and your hand so that you can't write anything either.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, well, I think that Maximus maintains the indefectibility of the papal see there.
yeah.
When you note the quote there, and of course he appeals to the divine promise of the Lord. Of course,
He does.
the divine promise of the Lord can't fail, therefore the Roman see won't fail. So yeah,
Right.
I
Now,
always.
I should mention for people who are thinking about getting this book,
Mm,
I asked the publishers, like, do you want me to tackle Eastern Orthodoxy in this book, like the historical disputes? They said no,
mm,
because the action. I mean, we know there was lots of schisms, like Schism of Photius and all these other ones that happened in this period, which I do cover. But as far as like the ultimate real issues between East and West, since that didn't crystallize until after 1027, they told me to leave it for the author of the next volume, which I was kind of thankful not to have to wade into.
right. That's
I
a
got,
whole book in and of itself.
I
Yeah.
know, I got to like being like to the last 10 pages of the book, and I said, "Do you want me to go into the?" They're like, "No, no, 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 leave that for the next guy."
Yeah, that makes sense. So, I mean, you do ask the question, though. Let me see the way you phrased it here.
Yeah.
Did the Eastern churches ever affirm the primacy of Rome? So go ahead and tackle that one for us.
Well, yeah. There was a formulation called the Formulary of Hormisdas, which is the most notable example. Um, this was in the context of the Acacian Schism of 519, which was a schism about who was the rightful patriarch of Constantinople, if I'm not mistaken, which I might be. um, but the formula of Hormisdas, which was a formula sworn by the Patriarch of Constantinople himself. So this wasn't just like some monk or some bishop. This was the Patriarch himself. This was to reconcile with Rome. He said, following the Apostolic See in all things and proclaiming all its decisions, we endorse and approve all the letters which Pope St. Leo wrote concerning the Christian religion. And so I hope that I may deserve to be associated with you in the one communion which the Apostolic See proclaims, in which the whole true and perfect security of the Christian religion resides. I promise from now on that those who are separated from the communion of the Catholic Church, that is, who are not in agreement with the Apostolic See, will not have their names read during the sacred mysteries. So that is a profound statement. He says that to be not in agreement with the Apostolic See is to be separated from the communion of the Catholic Church. And he also says that the whole true and perfect security of the Christian religion resides in the Apostolic See. So it's a pretty profound affirmation of the position of Rome, I think. Now, I should mention, if you go online and Google like Eastern Orthodox formula for Misdis, of course they have their own answers to that, their own responses to it, which I don't go into the book, but I think that is a real. I don't know. There's other.
Let's see. I think the video's freezing up there. Are you able to hear me, Philip?
Can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear you now. I don't
Okay.
know if you froze up or I froze up or what.
Yeah,
You froze up on my end, but I don't know if it's from my end or what.
No, it's my end. I live in the middle of nowhere, and we're having a blizzard. So.
Oh, fun stuff. Hey, I've done a show before with a tornado nearby, so yeah,
No
I know
kidding.
how that goes.
Wow.
There was another show where I almost got struck by lightning, so that was a fun one too.
Wow.
Well, let me ask you a couple more questions, and we're going to go to some live chat questions here. Tell me about some of the controversies in the, again, I don't like the term Dark Ages, but in this time period that involved the sacraments.
Oh, yeah. So now we're talking. This. So I have a whole chapter on this, sacramental controversies. So one of the major controversies was about marriage, because I mean, everybody knew from patristic times, right? If you were getting married as a Christian, this was a sacramental reality. But there's a lot of unresolved questions about marriage, and you might think, what's so complicated about marriage? Well, I can give you an example. So here's just a list of some of the controversies about marriage. At what moment is a couple actually married? Is it when they pronounce the vows? Is it when they offer their inner consent? Is it when the marriage was consummated after the ceremony? So these were three different positions people argued. Then there was questions of who actually conferred the sacrament. Was it an act of the man taking the woman as his wife? Was it bestowed by the church in the person of the minister? Did the man and wife confer it on themselves? Also, if the sacrament was brought about by the words and vows, does it matter which specific words were spoken? Because obviously we know in baptism and the Eucharist, there's very specific prayers. And if you mess with those prayers, then you can invalidate the sacrament. So the question for marriage, does it matter what words are spoken? Also, more practical things, could cousins marry each other? Was a pressing question in the Middle Ages. If so, within what degrees was it permitted?
Okay.
Did the church's minister need to physically witness the marriage, or was it sufficient that it take place in front of any witnesses and the church merely be notified of it? If the ceremony needed witnesses, how many witnesses sufficed? So these are all questions about the about kind of like the nuts and bolts of the sacrament. And actually, very important was that question of witnesses and the question of marrying cousins, because what would typically happen? We know that the church did not allow divorce, right? But we know that a marriage can be invalid for various reasons. So what would happen is people would get married with no witnesses. They would get married with no witnesses, and then when they wanted to split up, they would deny that they were ever married to begin with. And then there would be no way to prove that they had been married. They would say that they were just in a common law arrangement. So the church started to insist that it happen in front of a minister and with witnesses. This was I should say this was something the nobles tended to do, not your average person. But nobles tended to do this because marriage was very much something of a political dynastic arrangement, right? So, you marry one person, and then 5 or 6 years later, the political circumstances change. Maybe their family's star has fallen. You want to align yourself to someone else, and you say, I'm getting married to someone new, and the bishop says, hold on, you already got a wife, and you say, I was never married to her. We were just shacking up, and the bishop says, no, you were married. And then the noble says, prove it. And then nobody can prove it because there was no witnesses to the marriage. So throughout the Middle Ages, you find increasing stress on things like the marriage has to be announced. We know we had something called the marriage banns, where who was being married was published on the door of the church. It has to be done in front of witnesses. It has to be done in front of the church's minister, who confers the blessing of the church on it, recognizing the marriage. So that was a big issue. Another issue was, believe it or not, the marrying of cousins, because noble families tend to marry amongst each other, right? So most noble families are going to be related to some degree. So the church had earlier in the medieval period, it had forbid marriage within 4 degrees of consanguinity. That meant 4 degrees. It's complicated to talk about the family trees, but 4th cousins could not marry. You had to get to your 5th cousin before you could marry.
Golly, I don't even know my 2nd cousin. How would you figure that out?
This is a great point, Michael, because you might think oh, good, we don't want to marry our cousins, but as soon as you get past 1st cousins, the family tree gets huge.
Yeah,
and you got situations in the latter Carolingian period where there was nobles who were saying I literally can't find a person in my region that isn't at least a 4th cousin,
right.
because they're all interrelated. And so there was all these petitions for dispensing from the rule about, you can't marry within 4 degrees, until finally at the Fourth Lateran Council, they changed it to make it 2 degrees. So now, good news, people. Now you can marry your third cousin.
Right, there you go. Wonderful.
You can find them. So that was some interest. So with marriage, it was a lot of very practical stuff, right? Practical stuff. With the Eucharist, it was all very theoretical disputes about. And I stress this in the book. Protestants will often try to say that, in the early Middle Ages, Christians did not believe in the real presence or in transubstantiation, and then it kind of was invented in 1215 or came in later. The first person that really denies the real presence is Berengar of Tours in the early 11th century, and he's at the very end of the early Middle Ages, I think around 1005 or somewhere like that. But the disputes about the Eucharist were about what kind of presence Christ had in the sacrament, because everybody knew that Christ was truly, really in the Blessed Sacrament, but they struggled to understand what that meant in the context of Christ's earth. If we say this is Christ's body, does this mean it's exactly identical with his earthly body? Is it a different kind of body? Is it like a glorified heavenly body that's not the same as his earthly body? If it's not, how do we explain why it's not like cannibalism, or why it's not carnal? How come it's not like receiving Christ's body in a carnal, cannibalistic way? So what they were struggling to, and you'll find people that went on both sides of this argument. You found some that were, well, what they were struggling to do was to come up with a vocabulary to describe Christ's presence, right? Because they didn't have words like transubstantiation and stuff like that. So they're trying to uncover something, what we would call today the sacramental mode of Christ's presence, where we have a way of explaining how Christ is present in the sacrament, that it's his real, true, substantial, physical body, the same body that walked the earth, born and died, but not under carnal forms, right? Not under carnal forms. And that's what they needed to work out. And that's really what this controversy with Berengar was about. He kind of pushes it too far, and he starts saying that it's merely a spiritual reality, or it's merely symbolic. And then as soon as he starts saying spiritual reality only, the church starts hammering down on him. He was condemned 5 times it was very unambiguous. It wasn't even a real debate. Like every time he put this forward, he got condemned. Eventually, he recanted and spent the rest of his life on the Isle of Cosme doing penance. But I think that was really formative, and this development is going to culminate, like I said, at the Fourth Lateran Council, where we're going to get the phrase transubstantiation to describe the change and the sacramental mode of presence specifically.
Seems like that there was another controversy on the Eucharist a little bit before. I think it was Berengar, I think is how you pronounce it. You have Retramnus and Radbertus. That was an interesting debate.
Yeah, there's a whole I have a whole section on them. See there, I have a whole section on well, you probably can't see Paschasius Radbertus there. But the section here, it says not whether but how. And this is what I was saying earlier, like they're not debating. It was Paschasius Radbertus versus Retramnus, and they're not debating whether Christ is present. They're trying to understand how he's present.
Right.
And they have two different arguments for how he is present. So this argument will predate Berengar's by several generations. But I think Berengar is the first one to actually deny the real presence in the Catholic
takes
sense.
It a step further.
Yeah, because neither Paschasius nor Retramnus are denying that Christ is truly present. They're offering different theories of how he's present, which is really interesting because now we are so used today in the context of like Protestantism to only debating like, is he truly there or not? It's outside our mode of argument to read these disputes about how he's present.
Yeah.
But I think they're fascinating, and there's several pages on it in the book.
Now, last question before we get to the live chat questions. Can you briefly talk about the Cluniac reforms and how they're important to this time period?
Yeah. The Cluniac reforms were a series of reforms to, restore independence to the church's monastic life. It was very common for churches and monasteries to be under a lay protector, who often pilfered the coffers of the monastery. So Cluny was a monastery that was established independent, I think around the year 911 by William of Aquitaine. And he granted Cluny independence from any lay oversight so that they could develop their spiritual life and their monastic practices without having to worry about any secular lord. And so this caused their monastic life to flourish. And everybody who was the most serious about their spiritual life came to Cluny to join that monastery. And so they gradually picked up other ideas that they incorporated, which was a great solemnity in their liturgical worship. Also, they're very hostile to simony, which is the buying and selling of church offices, and stressing, reaffirming clerical celibacy. So these were the ideals that they wanted church life to be reformed on, and they really were very popular in the 10th century. And Cluniac monks would end up working their way up into the hierarchy of the church. In the 11th century, a Cluniac monk, Hildebrand, will become Pope Gregory VII. And then the Cluniac reform will become the program of reform for the universal church in the late 11th century. So it's very influential in terms of kind of restoring the discipline of the church, the moral quality of the church, and also breaking away from dependence on temporal protectors, we'll say.
There's a question here. What does the church take today, or what is the church take today on when marriage is consecrated? You know, in light of what you were saying here historically.
Yeah, I'm not a theologian, but my understanding is that the marriage, the sacrament of marriage, you are married when you pronounce the vows publicly in front of the church's minister. That's my understanding. But the sacrament doesn't become indissoluble until it's consummated. That's the moment when it becomes indissoluble. But it's when you pronounce the vows in front of the minister.
And y'all go ahead and send some more chat questions. Send them to @Reason and Theology. Another one, how did the feudal system affect this cousin marriage thing with the peasants and all that?
What do they mean? How would it affect it with the peasants and all that?
and all that. I love that. Yeah. I, yeah, the feudal system affect the cousin
Oh,
marriage
like
thing.
could peasants
Yeah,
marry their cousins?
right. I mean, it sounds like they eventually caved, as you mentioned there, from the fourth degree to the second degree.
Yeah, well, I mean, you could. I mean, anyone could, but the thing is, the nobles were more likely to want to marry their cousins for the
Mm,
purposes of keeping, of dynastic reasons. I mean, most peasants probably didn't have I mean, you could if you wanted to. You got a cute third cousin. You want to, whatever, But I think it wasn't as pressing for the peasants as it was for the nobles.
mm. Um, Yeah, we'll go with this one. Can we get a few words on Cyril and Methodius? When was the Roman Rite adopted to Slavonic and Glagolica, and any arguments against Jerome's origin of Glagolica?
No comment on Jerome.
Hmm. Hmm.
On Cyril and Methodius. Uh, when was the Roman Rite adapted to the Slavonic Glagolica?
Was
Does
it
that
adapted? I mean, what was the Roman Rite liturgically adapted in Slavonic? Is that really what Cyril and Methodius did, or did they not bring more of the Byzantine rite?
my understanding was, well,
I thought they brought the Byzantine rite. I'm not aware of them adapting the Roman rite in Slavonic. Now I know there were,
yeah,
the Pope, of course, was reaching out to that territory a little bit before Cyril and Methodius, but I'm not aware of them bringing the Roman rite in Slavonic to them.
yeah. I'm not going to be able to answer that. I just don't know the answer. But
There's
I do
a
know that
Yeah.
they faced considerable pressure to make it the Latin Roman Rite from the Carolingian rulers. But
Yeah, now this one is on Saint Benedict. Did the Benedictine rule have any in had any in Byzantine monasticism? Did it have any impact on Byzantine monasticism?
I'm I'm going to say not that I'm. I mean, not that I'm aware of. I mean, I'm sure they were aware of it, but the
Hmm.
Byzantines had a long tradition of monasticism by the time the Benedictine rule even emerged. And I think that Byzantine monasticism developed along a totally different line than it did in the West.
Mm-hmm. It kind of seems like it's the other way around, that it was really the East that impacted Benedict. If I'm not mistaken, if I recall correctly, it seems like some of the Desert Fathers and their rules. I think it was the rule of Pachomius ended up influencing indirectly Benedict.
Yeah, yeah, and Benedict himself was obviously reading the lives of these Eastern fathers.
Mm,
In the West, you had various organizations like the rule of Augustine, you know, but he of course was influenced by reading Saint Anthony, and there was Byzantine monasteries in southern Italy and in Sicily. So I think it was more that the Eastern stuff was known in the West rather than the other way around. Because
yeah.
by the time you get to Saint Benedict's life, most people weren't reading Latin in the East anymore anyways, so I don't know how
Mhm.
much impact it would have had.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, thank you so much for coming on, Philip. I really appreciate this. This was a really, really good discussion. You're welcome on the show anytime. And by the way, I mean, obviously, we're putting in a plug for the book itself, which again, y'all can check out there in the description and order a copy. It's published by Ave Maria Press. Again, the title is The Church in the Dark Ages by Philip Campbell. But in addition to that plug, put in a plug for anything else that you want to direct the audience to.
Well, I'm a history teacher for high school for an online Catholic um, curriculum provider called Homeschool Connections. I have
Mhm.
over 20 plus classes that you can get live and recorded access to. So if you're interested, I'd encourage you to go check out Homeschool Connections and look up some of my classes. And if you want to follow me online, I have a Facebook page called Philip Campbell, author teacher, and a YouTube channel, Mr. Campbell Explains.
Awesome. Like I said, Philip, I'd love to have you back on sometime.
I would love to come back.
And everybody, thank y'all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Go and purchase this book, and also check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology. See y'all later. Till next time. God bless.
If you're looking to buy or sell a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, you're going to want to call Real Estate for Life, and they're going to connect you with a Catholic agent. Now, that agent will donate a portion of their commission upon sale, and Real Estate for Life will donate 75% of that gift to a pro-life organization at no cost to you. Call Real Estate for Life at 1-877-LIFE-US1 or text them 248-431-1440. If you care about the pro-life cause, call them now.